A warm summer breeze swept through the busy downtown park, carrying with it the lively sounds of children laughing, street vendors shouting, and friends chatting on picnic blankets. It was an ordinary day, but not for Sergeant Elijah Carter. He stood near a shaded bench, his posture calm but commanding, a well-worn duffel bag at his feet. Elijah, a decorated military veteran, had seen more than his fair share of adversity, but today's battle wasn't on foreign soil. It was right here, in the heart of his own community. Elijah's steady presence caught the attention of passers-by. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a quiet strength in his eyes, he was hard to miss. He wasn't dressed for attention, just a simple t-shirt and jeans. But there was something about him that drew people in, as if they could sense his story before he ever spoke a word. He'd come to the park to relax, to enjoy a slice of peace in a world that often seemed to demand too much of him. But peace wasn't what this day had in store. A commotion stirred across the street. 2 squad cars parked haphazardly along the curb, their flashing lights cutting through the otherwise cheerful scene. Officer Daniels stepped out, his movements sharp and purposeful, a man who exuded authority but lacked warmth. Daniels was known around town, not for his fairness or dedication, but for his habit of making assumptions that too often targeted people who looked like Elijah. The park grew quieter as people took notice of the officer, their conversations faltering under the weight of collective unease. Elijah turned his head, his sharp eyes catching the scene unfolding. Daniels was walking toward a young black man who had been sitting at a picnic table with a group of friends. The man's smile faded as Daniels approached, his body tensing as if bracing for the inevitable. "You mind explaining what we're doing here?" Daniels asked, his voice loud enough to carry across the park. The young man, clearly taken aback, stammered, "I'm just sitting here, sir. We're having lunch." Daniels didn't seem to hear him or didn't care. "This park has rules," he said, his tone cold. "And I need to see some ID." Elijah's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. He'd seen scenes like this play out too many times before. His heart ached for the young man, who now stood with shaking hands as he pulled out his wallet. The man hadn't done anything wrong. Everyone could see that. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The crowd began to gather, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Some pulled out their phones, their cameras trained on the unfolding interaction. Elijah remained rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He didn't know the young man, but he knew this moment all too well. It was a moment of power unbalanced, of fear weaponized. And it was a moment Elijah could not ignore. As Daniels continued his interrogation, Elijah picked up his duffel bag and began walking toward them. His steps were deliberate, his face calm but resolute. The crowd parted slightly as he moved, their whispers growing louder. By the time Elijah reached the edge of the scene, all eyes were on him. "Excuse me, officer," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. Daniels turned to face him, his expression hardening as he took in the sight of Elijah. "Is there a problem here?" "This doesn't concern you," Daniels snapped, clearly annoyed at the interruption. But Elijah didn't back down. "It does if you're treating someone unfairly," he replied, his tone unwavering. Daniels looked him up and down, his disdain thinly veiled. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked. Elijah didn't flinch. "Sergeant Elijah Carter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that years of service had given him. "United States Army, retired. I'm asking you again, what's the problem here?" The crowd held its collective breath, their phones still recording. Daniels hesitated, clearly caught off guard. He hadn't expected someone like Elijah to step in. And now he was faced with a dilemma. A veteran, standing tall and resolute, challenging his authority in front of a growing audience. This man, Daniels began, gesturing toward the young man, was acting suspiciously. I have every right to question him. Elijah's eyes narrowed, his voice sharpening. Suspicious how? By sitting in the park, by having lunch with his friends, or by simply being black in your line of sight? Daniels bristled, his face flushing with anger. The tension in the air was palpable, the crowd inching closer as they realized this was more than just another confrontation. This was a moment of reckoning, a collision of prejudice and resistance, and no one could predict how it would end. "Watch your tone," Daniels warned, his voice low and threatening. But Elijah didn't budge. "No," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. "You watch yours, because what happens next will define who you are, not just to this young man, but to every person watching here and beyond." The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder. Daniels looked around, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride too stubborn to let go. Elijah stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. This wasn't just about one young man, one officer, or even one park. It was about something bigger, about justice, accountability, and the courage to confront what's wrong, no matter the cost. The moment teetered on the edge of explosion, every second stretching into eternity. The crowd waited, their phones poised, their hearts pounding. And Elijah, a man who had faced war and come out stronger, prepared himself for the battle ahead. What would happen next would leave the park, the city, and perhaps the nation talking for weeks to come. But in that moment, all anyone could do was wait and watch. Daniels clenched his jaw, his hand resting on his belt, as if seeking reassurance from the weight of his authority. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their discontent palpable. Elijah stood firm, his eyes steady, his presence commanding without aggression. It was a stance he had perfected in the military, strong but not threatening, a quiet confidence that demanded respect without words. "Step back," Daniels barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise. But the command didn't have the desired effect. Instead of dispersing, the crowd closed in slightly, their phones capturing every detail of his face, his tone, his body language. Daniels glanced around, a pressure building. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Yet his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Not here, not like this. Elijah, however, didn't move. He wasn't looking to escalate the situation, but he wasn't going to let injustice slide, either. His years in the military had taught him the value of composure under pressure. And right now, his calmness was the only thing keeping the situation from boiling over. "I'm not here to cause trouble, officer," Elijah said, his voice even. "But I think we both know this young man hasn't done anything wrong. Why don't we take a step back and handle this the right way?" Daniel's eyes flicked to the young man, who was still standing there, his ID trembling in his outstretched hand. The officer hesitated, the slightest crack appearing in his hardened expression. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. Elijah seized the moment. "You see them," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "They're not here because they want to make your job harder. They're here because they care about justice. They want to see it done. And right now, that means you making the right choice." The tension was suffocating, the kind of silence that made every sound. The chirp of a bird, the rustle of leaves, feel amplified. Daniel shifted on his feet, his hand dropping from his belt. He looked down, his face flushed with a mixture of frustration and something else. Shame, perhaps, though he would never admit it. The young man, sensing a possible shift in the dynamic, finally found his voice. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his words quiet but firm. "I'm just here with my friends, that's all." Daniels didn't respond. For a moment, it looked like he might back down, might let this moment pass without further conflict. But then, as if driven by an internal need to reassert his authority, he squared his shoulders and took a step forward. "This isn't about race," Daniels said, his voice louder now, as if trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. "It's about making sure everyone is safe. I'm just doing my job." Elijah's expression didn't change, but there was a sharpness in his gaze now, a steeliness that hadn't been there before. "Your job," he repeated, his tone measured but firm, "is to protect and serve. All of us, equally. Do you think you're doing that right now?" Daniel's face hardened again, the cracks in his demeanor sealing over. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. "Leave him alone?" A woman shouted. Others joined in, their voices rising in support. "He didn't do anything. This is wrong." The collective frustration of the crowd was bubbling over, and Daniels seemed to realize he was losing control of the narrative. Elijah raised a hand, signaling for calm. The crowd quieted, their trust in him evident. He turned back to Daniels, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "We've all made mistakes, officer," he said. "But what matters is how we handle them. This is your chance to show everyone here who you really are." For a moment, it looked like Daniels might listen. His posture softened slightly, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But then his radio crackled, breaking the silence. A voice came through, sharp and authoritative. "Officer Daniels, status report." Daniels reached for the radio, his hand shaking slightly. "I've got it under control," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. He glanced back at Elijah, his expression a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. Elijah stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Daniels could hear. "This isn't just about today," he said. "It's about every decision you make from here on out. You can either keep walking this path, or you can change. But know this, what you do now will follow you." Daniels stared at him, his face unreadable. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. The crowd waited, their phones still recording, their collective gaze fixed on the two men at the center of it all. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, Daniels took a step back. He lowered his radio, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. He looked at the young man, who was still standing there, his ID clutched tightly in his hand. "You're free to go," Daniels said, his voice barely audible. The young man blinked, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. "Really?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Daniels nodded, though he didn't meet the young man's eyes. "Go," he said again. The young man hesitated for a moment longer before stepping back toward his friends, who welcomed him with relieved smiles and pats on the back. The crowd murmured in approval, their voices a mixture of relief and satisfaction. But Elijah didn't move. He stayed where he was, his eyes locked on Daniels. "It's not enough to let him go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to do better. For him. For all of us." Daniels didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. The crowd began to disperse, the tension slowly fading, but Elijah remained rooted to the spot, watching as Daniels turned and walked back to his squad car. As the officer drove away, Elijah finally allowed himself to relax. He turned back to the young man and his friends, offering them a small, reassuring smile. "You okay?" he asked. The young man nodded, though his hands were still shaking slightly. "Yeah," he said, "thanks to you." Elijah shook his head. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about all of us standing up for what's right. Don't forget that." The young man nodded again, his smile growing a little steadier. Elijah gave him a pat on the shoulder before picking up his duffel bag and walking away, his steps slow but purposeful. The park returned to its usual rhythm, but the air felt different somehow, charged with the weight of what had just happened, and the promise of what could come next. The evening air carried a quiet buzz, the city slowly winding down after another long day. Elijah walked steadily down the street, his duffel bag over his shoulder. The echoes of what had just happened in the park lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time he had stood up in a situation like that, and deep down he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, a look in Officer Daniels' eyes, anger mixed with hesitation, shame clashing with pride, stuck with him. It wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about a system that allowed such actions to feel normal. A familiar voice called out, pulling Elijah from his thoughts. "Hey, Sergeant Carter." He turned to see Marcus, one of the young men from the park, jogging to catch up. His friends stood a few yards away, watching nervously. Marcus looked up at Elijah with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah nodded, shifting his bag slightly. "What's on your mind?" Marcus hesitated, glancing back at his friends before speaking. "How do you say so calm?" "I mean back there, with that cop. I don't think I could have done that. I'd be too mad, too scared." Ellinger looked at the young man for a moment, seeing the worry etched into his features. He let out a small sigh. "It's not about not being scared," he said. "It's about what you do with it. Fear can control you, or you can use it. And staying calm, that's something you learn with time. You've got to keep your head, even when it feels like the world's against you." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "But does it ever change anything?" he asked quietly. "I mean really change." Ellinger paused. He understood the weight behind the question. It was the same one he had wrestled with countless times. "Sometimes," he said finally. "Not always. But if you don't stand up, nothing changes. And when enough people stand together, even the hardest systems have to shift." Marcus seemed to chew on Elijah's words for a moment before nodding again. "Thanks," he said, a little more confidently this time. He offered a small smile before turning back to his friends, who welcomed him with quiet cheers. Elijah watched them go, a sense of hope stirring in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Elijah continued on his way, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Daniels wasn't over. His instincts, honed by years of service, told him there was more to come. He reached the corner where his car was parked, but before he could get in, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out to see a message from a number he didn't recognize. The text read, "Asterisk, so what happened at the park? You're a brave man. We need more people like you. Let's talk. Asterisk." Elijah frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. The message was vague, but something about it felt off. He debated whether to respond, but decided to let it sit for now. He had learned long ago to trust his gut, and right now it was telling him to be cautious. Meanwhile, Daniels sat in his patrol car in a parking lot a few blocks away. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The humiliation from earlier replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each memory more bitter than the last. He had seen the crowd's judgment, felt their disdain. And worse, he had seen the unwavering conviction in Elijah's eyes. He slammed his hand against the wheel, the sharp sound echoing the confined space. He hated how powerless he had felt, how exposed. But underneath the anger was something he didn't want to admit. Doubt. Maybe Elijah had a point. Maybe he had acted out of line. But admitting that would mean confronting a part of himself he wasn't ready to face. Daniel's radio crackled, breaking through his thoughts. It was his supervisor, asking for an update. He grabbed the receiver, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "All clear," he said. "No issues." As he ended the transmission, he glanced at his dashboard camera. The entire encounter at the park had been recorded. He knew he should report it, knew it was protocol. But instead, he ejected the memory card and slid it into his pocket. For now, he wasn't ready for anyone else to see it. Back at his small apartment, Elijah dropped his bag by the door and sank into the worn couch. The room was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic outside. He leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had done the right thing at the park. He knew that. But the larger fight felt overwhelming, like trying to push back an ocean with a single bucket. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was a call. The same number from before. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A deep voice on the other end responded. "Sergeant Carter, my name is Raymond. I work with a local community group focused on police accountability. I saw a video from today. It's already making the rounds online." Elijah sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. "I didn't know anyone was posting it yet." "They are," Raymond said, "and it's gaining traction. People are talking about what you did, how you handled yourself. It's powerful, but it also puts you in a spotlight. You should be prepared for pushback." Elijah rubbed a hand over his face. "I didn't do it for attention," he said. "I just wanted to make sure the kid didn't get hurt." "And you did," Raymond replied. but the attention is here now, whether you wanted it or not. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Elijah didn't have an answer. Instead, he thanked Raymond and ended the call. He sat there for a long time, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in making a difference where he could. But this was different. This was bigger than him. Somewhere across the city, Daniels poured himself a drink, the faint glow of his TV casting shadows on the walls. The news anchor was talking about increased scrutiny on police conduct, mentioning recent viral videos. Daniels turned the volume up, his stomach twisting. He knew what was coming. It was only a matter of time before his face was plastered all over the screen. As the night deepened, two men sat in different corners of the same city, both feeling the pull of an unavoidable confrontation. One sought justice. The other struggled with the weight of his own choices. The threads of their lives were tangled now, and the tension between them was far from over. The city buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the video from the park continued to spread online. Every hour, new comments and shares piled on, turning the once small incident into a lightning rod for conversations about justice, accountability, and change. For Elijah, this sudden spotlight felt like a double-edged sword. While he was glad the video was sparking discussions, he worried about how it might escalate the situation with Officer Daniels. Elijah stood in his living room, staring out the window at the street below. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes, a growing pressure that came with being thrust into the center of a movement he hadn't planned for. The sound of his phone vibrating pulled him out of his thoughts. Another call, this time from someone he recognized, Lisa, a reporter who had covered local issues for years. Elijah, her voice came through, calm, but laced with urgency. I've been trying to reach you. The video from the park is everywhere. People want to know your side of the story. Would you be willing to speak on the record? He hesitated, his mind racing. While he didn't shy away from standing up for what was right, the thought of being thrust into the media spotlight made his stomach turn. Lisa, I don't know if that's a good idea, he finally said. This isn't about me. It's about something much bigger. That's exactly why you need to speak, she replied. People see you as a symbol of courage. Your words could inspire real change. Elijah sighed, conflicted. Let me think about it, he said before hanging up. He couldn't shake the feeling that his involvement was far from over, whether he wanted it to be or not. Across town, Daniels sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the remnants of a takeout meal pushed to the side. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and notifications, some supportive, others scathing. He had avoided watching the video, but the comments people threw at him in passing were impossible to ignore. Words like racist and abusive hit him harder than he expected, leaving a knot in his chest he couldn't untangle. He reached for the memory card he had taken from his dashboard camera, turning it over in his fingers. It felt heavier than it should, a symbol of his indecision. Part of him wanted to come clean, to admit he had made a mistake. But another part, the part ruled by pride and fear, whispered that doing so would destroy everything he'd worked for. As the night wore on, Daniels found himself scrolling through social media, his name tagged in countless posts. One in particular caught his eye. A statement from the police department, vaguely acknowledging the incident, but not naming him directly. The words "under review" stood out, making his pulse quicken. He knew what that meant. They were trying to distance themselves from him. Frustrated, Daniels slammed his phone down and stared at the memory card again. He could hear Elijah's words from the park echoing in his mind. Asterisk, what you say next will define you. Asterisk ignored at him, a truth he couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Elijah received another unexpected visitor. Raymond, the man who had called earlier, showed up at his door with a group of community leaders. They carried a sense of purpose, their faces serious but hopeful. Elijah, we need your help, Raymond said without preamble. The momentum from that video is growing, but we need a strong voice to guide it. You've been in the trenches, both on the battlefield and here at home. People trust you. Elijah looked at them, their eyes filled with expectation. He felt a familiar pull, the same one that had driven him to enlist all those years ago, a sense of duty, of responsibility. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he asked. "We're organizing a town hall," Raymond explained. "We want to bring the community together to talk about what happened and what needs to change. Having you there could make all the difference." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of the request settling on his shoulders. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there." The days leading up to the town hall were a whirlwind. The video continued to gain traction, with news outlets picking it up and amplifying the story. Elijah found himself fielding calls from reporters, activists, and even strangers who wanted to thank him or share their own stories of injustice. Each interaction added to the pressure, but it also strengthened his resolve. Daniels, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once greeted him with camaraderie now kept their distance. The whispers followed him wherever he went, their sting sharper than he anticipated. He knew he was at a crossroads. The memory card still sat in his pocket, a constant reminder of the decision he had yet to make. The night of the town hall arrived, and the atmosphere in the community center was electric. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Elijah stood near the back, observing the crowd. He could see the weight of their stories in their eyes, each one carrying their own battle scars. When it was his turn to speak, the room fell silent. Elijah stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. He spoke of his experiences not just as a veteran, but as a black man navigating a world that often judged him unfairly. He spoke of accountability, not just for individuals like Daniels, but for the systems that allowed such behavior to thrive. As Elijah's words filled the room, Daniels stood outside in the shadows listening. He had come, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a need to understand the man he had clashed with. Whatever the reason, he couldn't bring himself to leave. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions and unresolved emotions. Elijah ended his speech with a call to action, urging everyone to work together for change. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing through the night. Daniels watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. If he wanted to find redemption, or even just peace, he would have to step forward. But as the applause died down, he hesitated, unsure if he had the courage to face what was coming next. As the applause from Elijah's speech slowly faded, the community center buzzed with energy. People began breaking off into small groups, discussing what they'd just heard. Some exchanged stories of their own encounters with prejudice, while others strategized about the next steps to bring lasting change. Elijah mingled briefly, his calm demeanor masking the exhaustion settling over him. He had poured his heart into those words, but even as he looked around at the hopeful faces, he couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would only get tougher. Unbeknownst to Elijah, Daniels had slipped inside the community center. He lingered near the back, his cap pulled low over his face as he watched from the shadows. His chest tightened as he listened to people talk about their frustrations with the police, their voices laced with pain and anger. It wasn't just about Elijah or the incident in the park. This was about years of mistrust and hurt. Daniels felt like a stranger in his own community, but he couldn't leave. Something about Elijah's words had rooted into the spot, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth of his actions. Just as Elijah was preparing to leave, a commotion near the entrance pulled everyone's attention. A young woman, barely out of her teens, burst into the room, her face flushed and her breath coming in quick gasps. "There's a group outside," she managed to say, her voice trembling. They're saying they want to confront whoever was responsible for that video." The air in the room shifted immediately. Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd as people exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah moved toward the young woman, his calm voice cutting through the noise. "What kind of group? Are they armed?" he asked. "I don't think so," she replied, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "But they're angry. They've got signs, and they're shouting about the video, making the police look bad." The tension in the room became almost tangible. People began whispering about whether to stay or leave, their voices rising with every passing second. Elijah looked toward Raymond, who had also moved closer to assess the situation. "We need to keep everyone calm," Elijah said quietly. "This can't turn into something worse." Daniels, still lingering at the back, felt his pulse quicken. He realized with growing dread that the group outside was likely some of his own supporters, people who had taken the controversy as an attack on law enforcement as a whole. He had seen the heated comments online, the ones accusing Elijah of stirring the pot and painting all officers with the same brush. While Daniels hadn't condoned those remarks, he hadn't spoken out against them either, and now his silence was coming back to haunt him. As Elijah stepped outside, the crowd inside the community center followed cautiously, spilling out into the parking lot. Sure enough, a small but vocal group had gathered near the entrance, waving signs and shouting slogans about supporting the police. Most of their anger seemed directed at Elijah, though a few glared at the onlookers as if daring them to respond. "Hey," one man shouted, pointing directly at Elijah. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Making good cops look bad just to push your agenda." Elijah held up his hands, his voice calm but firm. "Nobody here is against good officers," he said. "This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about accountability and making sure everyone is treated fairly." But his words didn't seem to reach them. Another man stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You don't know what it's like to wear that badge," he shouted. "You don't know what we go through every day." The crowd behind Elijah began murmuring, some of them visibly bristling at the accusations. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity, and for a moment it felt like the situation might spiral out of control. Elijah knew he had to defuse it before things escalated further. Just then, a voice cut through the chaos, one that made Elijah's head snap around in surprise. "He knows more than you think." It was Daniels. He had stepped out of the shadows, his cap now off, his face exposed. The people in the protesting group looked stunned, their angry chants faltering as they recognized him. "Officer Daniels," one of them asked, confused, "what are you doing here?" Daniels hesitated, his hands clenched at his sides. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, including Elijah's. His heart pounded as he took a step closer to the group. "You're right," he said, his voice strained but steady. "Being a cop isn't easy, but that doesn't excuse what I did in that park." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the protesters seemed at a loss for words. Daniels took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I let my biases get in the way, and I treated someone who deserved my respect like a threat. That's on me. Not the department. Not anyone else. Just me." Elijah watched Daniels closely, his expression unreadable. The crowd from the community center remained quiet, their attention locked on the unfolding scene. Daniels turned to face the group of protesters. "If you're out here because you think this is about tearing down the police, you're wrong. It's about making us better. All of us." His voice grew firmer, the weight of his words carrying through the night. "And if I can admit I was wrong, maybe you should think about why you were so angry at someone asking for accountability." The group looked at each other, their anger visibly cooling. One by one, they began lowering their signs, their earlier defiance giving way to uncertainty. Some shuffled awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, while others turned to leave without another word. As the crowd dispersed, Elijah stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Daniels. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elijah extended his hand, a gesture of respect rather than reconciliation. Daniels hesitated before shaking it, the weight of the moment settling over both men. The tension in the parking lot eased, but the unresolved emotions lingered. Elijah turned back to the community members, his voice steady but heavy with purpose. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Change doesn't come easy, but tonight, we've taken a step forward." Daniel stood silently, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline drained from his body. He knew his actions tonight wouldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could be the start of something better.